everyone, and welcome to our second event in the Vandenberg Coalition series on the future of conservative foreign policy. Today, we are pleased to be joined by Dr. Inboden, Executive Director of the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas at Austin, and a member of the Vandenberg Coalition Advisory Board. Will has recently been working on a book project on President Ronald Reagan's foreign policy, the Peacemaker, out October 4th of this year. We are delighted to have Will with us today to discuss the history of conservative foreign policy, Reagan's approach, and his own experiences working on grand strategy as a member of the policy staff at the State Department and on the National Security Council staff. I want to remind our audience members that they can submit questions at any point in time to chat. We will collect those questions and ask them during the Q&A portion at the end of the session. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Will, who will make a few opening comments before we dive right into it. So Will, thank you so much for joining us today. We'd love to hear your opening thoughts on where we are in the conservative movement on foreign policy and your book project.
Great, thank you very much, Amanda, and great to see everybody. Greetings from Austin, Texas. So I just want to make a couple of framing remarks, both on how I suggest or hope we think about these debates, and then some highlights on the themes of how President Reagan and his foreign policy addressed these questions. So the first part on how we think about these debates about the future of conservative foreign policy, and I say this as both a scholar of this as well as a an erstwhile practitioner, and this is an appeal for more analytical clarity, by which I do think that too often in our debates we just conflate or mash up ways, means, and ends of policy and strategy. So when we talk about, are we more interventionist or anti-interventionist or isolationist or internationalist, those things matter. I'm not trivializing those at all. But sometimes those are really debates about means, when we also need to be talking about what are the end goals we seek, right? Is it an expansion of freedom in the world? Is it protecting American security? Is it maintaining stability in the international system? And all worthy goals. Obviously, we know that those are trade-offs. But sometimes those get conflated in other debates about how much should we value allies or not, what should our military budget be, how much should we be doing foreign assistance or democracy promotion programs, things like that. So this is not, I have my own thoughts on answers to these particular questions of ways, means, and ends. But as all of us are participants in these discussions and debates, like I said, it's an appeal for some analytical clarity there. And then related to that, even as and this is a segue into some of the discussion about President Reagan's foreign policy, as we are looking at historical antecedents for conservative foreign policy, looking at what the context was at the particular time, like what was the main threat, right? So much of Reagan's foreign policy is defined by the Soviet Union as the primary threat, and we'll talk more about what that means. Of course, in the George W. Bush administration, which I served, and many on this call also served, it was all about counterterrorism and a whole avenue of policies and strategies that flowed from that. Of course, in our current moment, it's primarily about this renewed great power contest competition with China and Russia, but we also have the threats from the Iranian nuclear program and North Korea and so on and so forth. This is not to say that insights or lessons from the past, from the 1980s, from the early 2000s are not applicable for our present moment, but just trying to distinguish between, where are there similarities, where are there lessons to be drawn, and then where was it just a different time and context. So that brings me to the Reagan administration. And as Amanda mentioned, I've been working for the last few years researching and writing this book on President Reagan's foreign policy coming out this fall. Was privileged to interview a few people who were even on this call who had served with President Reagan. And I know our audience runs the gamut between those who had served in the Reagan administration and those who were born after the Reagan administration was in office, right? But hey, I want to speak to all of you because I do think there's some insights in the book applicable to all, no matter what vintage you may be. Why the focus on the Reagan administration? I think we can say that Reagan was the last unambiguously successful two-term conservative president. Okay, and each one of those modifiers matter, right? Again, I was very honored to serve in the George W. Bush administration, also a two-term Republican president. I and many Bush alums, I think, are very proud of a lot of our accomplishments. But an honest reckoning means that we also had our share of significant failures and setbacks. This is not to say the Reagan administration didn't have its share of failures and setbacks, but in the aggregate, in the net assessment, I think we can say it was unambiguously successful as a two-term president. And so for those reasons, I think it bears taking a deeper dive, a closer look at the record of the Reagan administration as we're thinking about debates about conservative foreign policy today. And here's my top line points on Reagan's foreign policy, and then Amanda will lead me through a rigorous inquisition of questions to unpack these. Here's what was distinctive about Reagan when he took office. Every previous Cold War president, starting with Harry Truman, had primarily conceived of the Cold War as a great power contest between two rival superpowers, the United States and Soviet Union, that happened to also be a battle of ideas, between two rival ideological systems. Reagan's theory of the case reversed that. Reagan saw the Cold War as primarily a battle of ideas between the free world and Soviet communism that also happened to be a great power contest. So he did not at all disregard the great power dimensions of the contest. Okay, and we'll talk about that. But for him, that theory of the case of reversing that, saying this is primarily a battle of ideas, quite a bit flowed from that, right? So he saw Soviet communism as a wicked idea to be defeated, rather than a rival power block to be contained or balanced. And again, we can talk more about that. So following from this, there were, I think, two big end goals to Reagan's strategy. And again, going back to my earlier comments, distinguishing ways, means, and ends. What are his two big end goals? The first, and this is to preview the argument in my book, he wanted to bring the Soviet Union to a negotiated surrender. Okay, so there's a debate about, did Reagan want to win the Cold War or end it? Well, he really wanted to do both. He did want to defeat the Soviet Union. He wanted to bring that entire system of the Soviet Empire, of Soviet communism, to an end, but he wanted to do it peacefully. He was terrified, rightly, of nuclear war. He wanted to avoid, a hot, the Cold War turning hot, and so that's why diplomacy and negotiations were so central to so much of his strategy. But it was not to have some sort of negotiated settlement that keeps the Soviet Union intact. He wanted to bring them to an end. He just, unlike FDR, an unconditional surrender for the Nazis and Imperial Japan in World War II, Reagan sought to bring the Soviet Union to a negotiated surrender. So that was his end goal. And then the second part of that is equally important, but too often neglected, which is that in addition to bringing the Soviet Union to a negotiated surrender, Reagan wanted to promote freedom in the world. More specifically, he wanted to expand the number of market democracies in the world. Hence his very vigorous policies to promote free trade, to promote democracy, to promote human rights, so on and so forth, not just in the Soviet bloc, but even within the broader free world with America's authoritarian allies. And so that is equally important to understanding what his strategy was. And that was partly because he saw, freedom as a good end in itself, but he wanted to create a positive alternative to the Soviet bloc and the penury and oppression that was the lived reality for communist countries. So those are my top line big points. Amanda, over to you. Let's dive in.
Great, thank you so much for those comments, Will. You mentioned one of the reasons why you decided to study Reagan was his foreign policy success. And I'm wondering also if you see parallels between the challenges Reagan faced then and the challenges we're facing today, and if that was any part of the driving motivation for turning back to the study of this approach.
So, thank you, Amanda. And so again, with the caveat that there certainly are a number of differences between our present moment in 2022 and then the latter days of the Cold War, even with the US-China competition, obviously the economic intertwining between the US and China, we never had that with the Soviet Union. The arms race is of a different quantity. There's not a comparable Warsaw Pact with China right now. Right? Okay, so we can talk about the differences. That said, where this is going. Yeah, there are some remarkable similarities between the early 1980s and our present moment. And I'll just walk through a few. First, thinking about our own camp, in the late 1970s, early 1980s, Republicans and conservatives were very deeply internally divided over foreign policy. And we can talk about that a little bit more. You've got the Nixon, Ford, Kissinger wing pursuing détente and stability. You've got the Reagan wing, and we'll talk more about what they did. And then you had a smaller but still influential group of Republican doves, led by Mark Hatfield in the Senate, who wanted to slash defense spending and have a more accommodationist approach to the Soviet Union. Of course, geopolitically, you have a great power competition with a nuclear-armed Pacific Rim communist superpower, right? At the time as the Soviet Union, now it is China. Both a Pacific Rim power and a Eurasian landmass power. Again, there are some differences, but the basic, like I said, the fundamental geopolitics are quite similar. You had then as now the United States internally demoralized from having just lost our longest war in history. At the time then it was Vietnam. Now, of course, it's Afghanistan, and lost it, unfortunately, in a very visible, humiliating way with, a catastrophic withdrawal, right? Helicopters out of Saigon in '75, and what we've seen most recently in Afghanistan, and the accompanying refugee crisis and everything else, and the demoralization that causes the United States, right? We're feeling like we can't win as a country anymore. Economically, then as now you had rampant inflation, which was hurting our economy, hurting that of our allies, and then you had widespread protectionist sentiments, very resistant to free trade, calling for more tariffs and protectionism with our allies as well as our adversaries. Then as now, democracy seemed to be in retreat, right? The 70s were a great run for communism and a bad run for democracy. So you had, communist regimes being installed in Angola, in Ethiopia, in Cambodia, of course, in Nicaragua in 1979, and then militant Islam ascended in Iran, and it was the Iranian Revolution, 1979. Still a problem we're dealing with. And then I'll mention three even very interesting particular parallels between then and now. First, in the early 1980s, the United States and our NATO allies were in a fierce dispute over a oil and gas pipeline from Russia to Western Europe. It was a Siberian pipeline back then. We were sanctioning our allies over that, trying to stop it. Of course, it's Nord Stream 2 today. And then it bears mentioning that Canada then as now had a left-wing prime minister named Trudeau. It was Pierre back then, it's Justin now. And Nicaragua was ruled by a Marxist named Daniel Ortega. Same guy then as now. So anyway, I could go on, but you get it. There are some very interesting parallels between the challenges Reagan inherited and what we're facing today.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you see any parallels in terms of the divisions you mentioned between the Nixon, Kissinger wing and Reagan's wing, and how do those play out historically? Today, we have been talking here within our series about divisions between conservative nationalists and conservative internationalists, as well as conservatives and liberals. And I'd be curious to hear more about how Nixon and Kissinger battled Reagan as well.
Yeah, sure. And again, those of a certain vintage who lived through these debates in the 70s, this will certainly resonate. But as a matter of history, I think it's really important to recapitulate. So throughout the 1970s, Republican conservative foreign policy, with some nuances, was largely divided into two camps. There was the Nixon, Kissinger, and Ford camp, who had some considerable foreign policy successes, it must be said, but their framework was détente with the Soviet Union, and it was predicated on certain assumptions. The main one being that the Soviet Union was a stable, permanent fixture on the geopolitical landscape. Right? The Soviet Union is not going away. We need to live with them. Doesn't mean we like them. Doesn't mean that we want to surrender to them or let them have a free hand. But the Soviet Union is a permanent reality, and so therefore we need to reduce tensions with them, have some sort of equilibrium, if you will, while pursuing advantages elsewhere around the world. Again, the Reagan theory of the case was very different. Reagan's theory of the case is that the Soviet Union is brittle, is fragile, and is open to being defeated. And again, this goes back to what I said earlier about it's primarily a battle of ideas for him rather than just a geopolitical contest. And so he rejected détente. He said, détente is great for the Soviets. It's not good for the United States. And, détente's assumptions about Soviet stability and good behavior are not being played out as the Soviets are using détente to seize more and more advantage. Again, some parallels with how Putin has treated, different American overtures over the last 20 years. He'll pocket the concessions and seize more and more advantage. And so Reagan sees the Soviet Union as vulnerable to more pressure and push from the United States. However, he doesn't see the Soviets as only vulnerable. He also sees them as uniquely dangerous. And this may sound paradoxical, but I think it both can be true. The Soviet military might really reached its apex probably around 1982 or 83, and he knew that the United States had been losing in the military balance there. And so, but he also realized that a a fragile, potentially vulnerable superpower can be uniquely dangerous, kind of a cornered wounded bear, if you will. And so he had a lot to calibrate between bringing more pressure to crack the Soviets' vulnerabilities, while also making sure this does not turn into a catastrophic global war.
And what kinds of innovations brought to his Cold War strategy?
Sorry, I missed that one. Was this question?
What innovations did Reagan bring to his Cold War strategy?
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah. Innovations to his Cold War strategy. Okay. All right. So building on, again, the theory of the case about battle of ideas and Soviet vulnerability, there's really three main features to his Cold War strategy that I think were innovations that no previous president had done, or at least to this extent, or at least in this package. And these are wedges, pressure, and diplomacy. And I'll walk through the highlights of each of them. So first of all, as part of his effort to weaken and delegitimize the Kremlin and Soviet communism, Reagan sought to drive three wedges through areas of Soviet strength. Right. The first one was he wanted to separate the Kremlin from its own people. He made very clear, my beef is not with the Russian people, or certainly not with the people of other Soviet republics. It's with the Kremlin itself. And so this is why he was so fervent in his support for Soviet dissidents, for human rights and democracy, for the Siberian Pentecostals, or for Natan Sharansky or Sakharov, or any of the other dissidents, again, that those familiar with this era will remember. For him, it was all about reaching out to the peoples of the Soviet Union while marginalizing the government, and then driving more of a wedge there. And that's a way to weaken it. The second one was he wanted to drive a wedge between the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact satellites, right? So this is why the support for solidarity in Poland, support for dissidents throughout the Iron Curtain, realizing that these people do not like being in slavery to their masters in Moscow, and that there's a chance to break off or drive some wedges between the Warsaw Pact and the Kremlin itself. And the final one was between the wedge was between the Kremlin and the rest of the international community, right? And this is why so many of Reagan's efforts to promote human rights and democracy and free markets around the world is to bring more of the international community into the free world bloc, while again delegitimizing the Kremlin. So now the pressure part, and this follows from the wedges. The Reagan administration really did, and I know this is a cliche, but used all instruments of national power in a pretty well integrated, sometimes imperfectly, pretty well integrated effort to bring pressure to on the Kremlin from all dimensions. Okay, the military buildup, of course, is very well known. We can talk some more in the details about that. The nuances are really interesting, but to outbuild them in an arms race. Reagan used to say, he had a line. He said the Soviets much preferred the arms race when they were the only ones in it. He saw that, especially in the Carter years, the United States had really been ceding the ground to the Soviets. And so he wanted to bring the military pressure. But his economic statecraft, the economic pressure he sought to bring on the Soviets through, export controls, making sure they can't get, sensitive, advanced technologies they couldn't develop on their own, everything he could to prevent them from getting hard currency, even getting the Saudis to increase their oil output and therefore drive down the price of oil, which was the Soviets' main source of hard currency. Getting our European allies to quit giving low credit loans to the Warsaw Pact satellites and keeping them afloat. So anyway, lots of economic pressure designed to starve the Soviets. Then, of course, the Reagan doctrine, right? Supporting anti-communist insurgents, the Contras in Nicaragua, the UNITA rebels in Angola, the anti-communists in Cambodia, especially the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. The Soviets were spending billions of dollars trying to support these, communist regimes and keep them afloat. And Reagan saw this as a way to, starve the Soviets economically by forcing them to have to put more, resources with fighting, or even quite literally impose bloody costs on them in Afghanistan, and sending thousands of, Red Army soldiers home in body bags. Then, of course, the ideological dimension, right? I mean, he was waging ideological warfare, trying to delegitimize Soviet communism. Flooding the Iron, plenty of CIA covert action programs to flood the Iron Curtain with Western literature, with translations of Solzhenitsyn and Pasternak and sermons, right? This was the heyday for Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. So really bringing this full orb pressure on the Soviets from all sides. But finally, I just say, but finally, all this is being done while extending the hand of diplomatic outreach, right? So with one hand, he's punching them, he's slapping them. The other hand, he's saying, let's shake hands and let's talk, right? And yet, what gave the diplomacy a chance to succeed was all of that pressure. Okay, sorry, I got a little wound up on that one, but there's a lot going on here.
There's a lot to say for sure, and that's a fantastic overview. One of the key points you mentioned is that Reagan seemed to match diplomacy with force rather than think of them as two distinct tools of statecraft. They were married together. We found this Reagan quote where he said, "We know only too well that war comes not when the forces of freedom are strong, but when they are weak. It is then that tyrants are tempted." And President Trump similarly said the best way to keep America safe is to keep America strong. So do you see parallels between those two approaches? How do you see the Biden administration today using the tools of diplomacy and military force, and why it's important that those two tools be together?
Yeah, no, thanks. Very important point. And this is often a dividing line between conservative foreign policy and liberal or progressive foreign policy. Is we'll often hear with the Biden administration or the Obama administration do this. Well, we don't want to use force. Instead, we want a diplomatic solution. Or no, let's pursue diplomacy instead of force. And anytime the question is even phrased in that way, whether it's about the nuclear file with Iran or with North Korea or certainly with Russia or with China, in some ways you've already lost, right? Because you've made a profound conceptual error. The most effective diplomacy is diplomacy backed by force, or the threat of force at least. And this means having a very potent and capable military, and at least in theory, the willingness to use it. Although it bears saying that Reagan was very reticent or cautious about actually deploying ground troops in combat. The only time he does it in 8 years is in Grenada in 1983, a relatively small operation. But he still wanted to deploy force. So whether it's the intermediate range nuclear missiles in Western Europe or very aggressive naval exercises, or even the way we're arming anti-communist insurgencies around the world, he was looking for ways to build up and strengthen America's military might, precisely to give us a better hand at the negotiating table. And so anytime that you very upfront rule out any possible use of force, if you telegraph that to the bad guys that it's not even a question in your mind, they know they've beat you already. And that was something that Reagan and Schultz together were especially I think sophisticated in their thinking about. Our friend Henry now calls this armed diplomacy. I think that's a great way to put it. It's armed diplomacy.
Yeah, and Henry's also a member, I should say, of the Vandenberg Coalition's advisory board. So we know him well. And I want to remind our audience that they can submit questions that we will ask to Will at the end. That at any point you can send them in to the Q&A. So please continue to do so, and we will get to those at the end. Reagan was also a proponent of arming our friends to defend themselves. In recent years, we've had a lot of debate on the future of NATO and burden sharing. And I'm wondering how Reagan views that debate today. How would he explain the importance of burden sharing to the American people and the importance of NATO?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm always hesitant to say, if Reagan were here today, here's exactly what he would do. Okay, that's just probably unfair to any historical actor. That said, I do think that looking at his record on allies, there are a number of various insights. And I'll start with this. This is a strong statement, but I think it's borne out by the historical record. Ronald Reagan is the US president most devoted to allies, full stop, right? I mean, other presidents have loved our allies, that kind of stuff, but Reagan was deeply, passionately devoted to our allies. He never said a bad word about them in public. And he saw them as a really unique source of American strength, especially because our allies were voluntary, right? They wanted to be our allies as opposed to the coerced Warsaw Pact satellites. And you see this playing out in all sorts of levels. The deep friendships that Reagan built with leaders such as Margaret Thatcher or Nakasone in Japan, or Brian Mulroney in Canada, or Helmut Kohl in West Germany. Now, it also bears remembering, though, that just as Reagan was deeply, passionately committed to the Allies, would never badmouth them in public, they drove him crazy, right? He had endless frustrations with the Allies over all the usual things. The NATO allies in Japan weren't spending enough on defense. They were undercutting him on different areas of arms control negotiations. We could go through all those. And he had 8 years of frustrations and differences with allies. But it was all a squabble within the family, right? That's the key thing, is there's never any doubt about the core commitments there. So specifically, Reagan leaned very heavily on our NATO allies and on Japan to increase their defense spending and do better burden sharing, and not just increase the resources, but in the case of Japan, getting them to extend their maritime defense perimeter out 1,000 miles, right? And that lifted some of the burden off the Seventh Fleet, who could then be more active in Southeast Asia and in South and in the Indian Ocean, while Japan was helping bottle up the Soviet fleet there in Northeast Asia. But Reagan's way to do that was, not to scold in public, but rather I can show you a picture here. He grabbed Nakasone, who's a lot smaller than him, and give him a really tight hug and just tell, "I love you so much, man." And they'd squeeze him a little harder. And he'd say, "Butch, you guys got to do more. You've got to, ease up on your trade barriers, and you especially need to increase your defense spending." And because Nakasone knew that appeal was coming in the context of, "We're here with you. You're our most important ally in Asia, and we, the United States, are doing our part to spend more on defense." Nakasone delivered, and if you look at the numbers, it's remarkable. Over the eight years of the Reagan presidency, Japan triples in absolute dollars its defense spending. Right, so in addition to extending their commitments out. One more brief comment, though, is Reagan also looked way beyond just the military equation with allies. He saw them as tremendously important as diplomatic partners. So he and Thatcher were a very effective tag team with Gorbachev on human rights and getting more Soviet dissidents released. He partnered with Nakasone to make a real nudge to get Marcos to step down in the Philippines in 1986. Nakasone had been saying for years, Japan is the only Asian democracy. We need more democracies in Asia. And that's why Nakasone was eager to see Philippines and South Korea and others go through their democratic transitions. And then on intelligence, without going into all the details, during the 1980s, the United States benefited from three very effective sources inside the Kremlin, three very effective, Soviet officials who were agents. Two of those came from our allies. One was from British intelligence, one was from French intelligence. Only one was one the CIA cultivated. And so he just saw the full spectrum of benefits from the allies, and that in turn gave him more leverage to get the allies to step up.
You mentioned also that Reagan saw the Cold War contest not only as a great power competition, but as a contest of ideas. Do you think we could better employ strategic communications, psychological warfare, information statecraft in the competition with China or other great powers?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And again, this is where, looking at, the Reagan record, both his own personal commitments as well as resource allocation and things like that. He was, made a signal priority of positively promoting freedom around the world, again, as the alternative to communist oppression, but also delegitimizing Soviet oppression. And so you see this in his speeches, right? Phrases we remember, such as "evil empire," "tear down this wall," "ash heap of history." Those are notable terms of phrase, but behind all of those was a very effective strategy and significant resources. And this included, massive efforts to counter Soviet disinformation, right? I mean, they were doing their active measures back in the 80s, including trying to support Mondale instead of Reagan in 1984, as they're doing now. Or his visible meetings with dissidents, his efforts to highlight, communist oppression. And so for him, like I said, it really was primarily this battle of ideas. And that's why this culminates in, his 1988 visit to Moscow and his Moscow State Address. He really wanted to persuade the Soviet Union itself, the Russian people, to embrace, the principles of freedom, democracy, and human rights and free markets. And so it wasn't just getting rid of their old system. He said, "Hey, you guys have a better alternative, and it's for your own good to embrace this."
Yeah, today some analysts make a distinction, policymakers, between promoting freedom and promoting democracy, maybe promoting certain values versus promoting regime type. Do you see that as a necessary distinction? And if so, what are the differences between the two? What are the drawbacks of making a distinction, and maybe what are the benefits of not? I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So Reagan, the Reagan administration, I don't think saw itself as promoting one rather than the other. They really saw it, we're promoting freedom and democracy together. Rather is conceived as we're promoting a set of the values of freedom and the institutions of democracy. And this is why, he presides over the creation of the National Endowment for Democracy with his 1982 Westminster Address, which in turn leads to the creation of the International Republican Institute and NDI and those associated institutions. And so for him, he knew that it's not just about, rhetorical flourishes or whatever, but you have to give active diplomatic and economic support to cultivating these particular institutions. The interesting distinction or challenge for him was he had to use different methods and means to promote human rights in our adversaries, behind the Iron Curtain, especially in the Soviet Union, than he did with our allies and friends, and especially in the second term. And again, guys like Elliot Abrams and Paul Wolfowitz, who obviously are part of our Vandenberg Coalition, were very, very, very key on this. But this was, providing funding and diplomatic support to opposition parties in Taiwan and in South Korea and in the Philippines and in Latin America. Certainly easing Pinochet out in Chile in 1987 and 88, supporting El Salvador's democratic transition. So those, in some ways, were even harder than promoting human rights with our adversaries. Because with our adversaries, you can scold them publicly, you can be pretty aggressive, and there's not a lot of downside, right? I mean, you don't have any other equities with them. Whereas with some of these right-wing authoritarians, we needed to keep them as anti-communist partners. We did not want them to go communist. And we knew from the 1970s that was a real fear. But Reagan also realized that autocracy and repression done in America's name erode our moral capital and standing, and ultimately can be destabilizing. And just very briefly, a turning point for him is the Falklands War on this, right? So we often forget that in 1982, Argentina was one of our most important anti-communist partners in South America. Sure, the UK is also our most important ally, but the Falklands War initially, when Argentina, the military junta, invades the Falklands, is a fight between two important friends of ours. And that's why the administration was initially split before deciding to support the British. But for Reagan, one of the key takeaways was, wait a minute, I've been giving support to this right-wing military government in Argentina because they're anti-communist, but they don't have much popular support. And when they lose popular support, instead of having a free election, they go invade these islands that belong to our ally, the British. That's really destabilizing. And of course, right after that, the military government fell. And so that was one of several key points for Reagan in realizing long-term support for repressive authoritarians isn't necessarily consistent with our values or our interests. How you get there is much more complicated, but that's an important case study.
And turning toward the Reagan defense buildup, Reagan has been credited with bankrupting the Soviets. Mentioned that there may be more outsmarting versus outspending. What part of the story hasn't been told yet?
Yes, no, again, one of my favorite themes in the book, and of course, some of our friends like Tom Mencken in particular have done some great work on this. But my key summary is the story you hear that, oh, Reagan bankrupted the Soviet Union by outspending, putting more money in our military than they were able to keep up with, is not wrong. It's true, but it's just very incomplete. And so it's not just more money, it's how he spent that money. And my summary of that is he sought to outsmart the Soviets as much as outspend them. And so this is where he was building on some of the great work that Andy Marshall had done, and even some of the innovations at the Pentagon, in the Nixon and Ford and Carter administrations. And so he inherited some good thinking on this. But what he did is he then put a lot more resources into it and took it to the next level. And the key was this, is looking at where are some of the Soviets' comparative strengths militarily, right? So they had a lot more tanks than we did. They had like 80,000 T-72s to our 10,000 M1s. They had a much larger Navy. They had a much more potent ICBM force, right? They had twice as many SS-18s, which are more accurate than ours. And they had very effective air defense systems to neutralize our strategic bombers. And so rather than just trying to compete head to head with the Soviets on that, let's build as many ICBMs or let's build as many tanks, Reagan decided to turn those Soviet strengths into weaknesses by building a next generation of weapons platforms that would really neutralize those Soviet advantages in ways the Soviets could never keep up. Okay, so just a few examples. Instead of trying to build 80,000 tanks, we build the Apache helicopter and the A-10. Great tank killers, which can kill 20 or 30 Soviet tanks. Instead of trying to build as many subs, we developed very advanced quieting technology. So 20 Soviet subs couldn't find one of our subs, right? We developed stealth technology, the B-1 to go, underneath their radar, the B-2 to go right through it, cruise missiles to go underneath. And so no matter how many surface-to-air missiles or more radar they developed, they couldn't spend enough money to address that. Of course, the ultimate in this is the Strategic Defense Initiative, right? Which never became fully operational in the Reagan days, but didn't matter. The Soviets were scared of it to neutralize their ICBM advantage. And so that's where, by the time Gorbachev comes along, the Kremlin realizes not only are we going bankrupt, no matter, even if we had infinite sums of money, we can't match these American advances in military technology. And that was the key innovation in the Reagan defense buildup, which of course in turn strengthened diplomacy, right? So all these things fit together.
Turning to your own time serving in government, were there periods of policy planning or doing strategic planning on the National Security Council staff where you look back towards periods like the Reagan defense buildup to learn any lessons for the challenges you were facing at that time?
So yeah, well, first I'll say is I wished I would have known more about Reagan foreign policies when I was in the Bush administration than I did. So that's I had to wait till I got out of government to have time to research and write this book. But I will say that certainly the Bush administration on the National Security Council staff, we definitely looked to some of the Reagan precedents in fighting a battle of ideas against a pernicious totalitarian ideology, whether it's Soviet communism or jihadist terrorism. Definitely looked to the importance of allies as force multipliers, as sources of American strength in whatever particular conflict we're facing. Definitely looked to the importance of promoting freedom, democracy, human rights. Again, as normative goods in their own right, but also as asymmetric comparative advantages that the United States has over unfree societies. So those were some of the precedents that we had looked at, and I think we'd all say we got some of that right and some of it wrong. But I do think now that we're in this new competition, conflict, whatever we're going to call it with China, I'm comfortable calling it a new Cold War. It pretty much is that, even if there are some distinctions. Some of the Reagan lessons are even more relevant to today. So.
Yeah, and do you think some of the categories in terms of foreign policy, conservative nationalists, conservative internationalists, have changed over time from Reagan to the Bush years to now? Do you see those categories shifting, and where were the fault lines in your view, and where are they today?
Yeah, I think they've shifted a bit. And this is why I want to go back to my earlier comments about a lot of it is defined by the threat environment, right? I mean, so who is the big threat? And back then it was the Soviet communism. Later it was jihadist terrorism. Now it's China and frankly Russia, as we're seeing. And so a lot of the intramural debates within American conservatism, some of them will be retreating to first principles about what our nation's identity and values, but a lot of it's going to be defined about, okay, what's the big threat there? But that's where in some ways, it's not that we've come full circle, right? I mean, but there are more similarities now, even to our intramural debates in our present moment, as there were in the early Cold War. Again, as Colin said, between the conservative nationalists and internationalists and so on and so forth. One of Reagan's successes is he certainly took a firm stand on a lot of those, but he was able to build a broader coalition. Eventually some of the détenteniks got behind him. Nixon and Kissinger never fully so, but eventually they did. And he also had some pressure from the far right, if you will, right? Jesse Helms tormented him for the 8 years he was president, trying to get Reagan to be much more unequivocally supportive of the apartheid regime in South Africa or the Arena Party in El Salvador, as opposed to the Christian Democrats. So Reagan was, certainly took a ton of heat from the left, but he also took some heat from his own right too.
Yeah, and we have a question that came in from the audience about lessons, in particular for Ukraine today, as we're facing this challenge at the present moment. Are there any lessons we are not learning from Reagan and from the Cold War that are applicable today?
Yeah, no, this. So without going too far out on a limb, I'd say my worry with Ukraine is, we, the free world, the West, the NATO alliance, Ukraine itself are already way boxed in, right? I mean, I think it is notable that for all of the Soviet advances in the 1970s, the Soviet Union didn't invade any other countries after Reagan became president, right? I mean, they, and he bogged them down and then eventually kicked them out of Afghanistan. And so the very fact that Russia seems on the verge of an invasion of Ukraine, Reagan did everything he could to stop them from doing that, rolling through the Fulda Gap in Western Europe. But we're in some ways, we've already lost a lot of the deterrence, right? I mean, so for Reagan, he had put in place a very credible military and diplomatic and alliance deterrent against further Soviet expansionism, and then was focused on rolling it back. And so in some ways, we're already in a non-Reagan-esque situation. That said, I mean, he, one component of his strategy to bring down the Soviet Union was supporting independence and autonomy and dissidents in the Soviet republics. And so we, had some covert programs to support the Ukrainian Catholics, right, both as religious dissidents and Ukrainian dissidents. I hadn't mentioned earlier, but really, really important with the INF deployments in Western Europe in 1983 to counter the Soviet edge there and say, no, you're not going to go any further. And we're going to, you were pointing a gun at our head or our allies' head. Now we're going to point a gun at your head. Now we can talk, right? And we just have not done that with Ukraine. And so there's been a massive failure of deterrence. I mean, what really seems to be going on right now is the Biden administration is essentially conceding Ukraine already and is now trying to plan for how do we stop it from going any further.
Yeah, and it's hard for me to ask you to speak for President Reagan, but how do you think Reagan would make the case to the American people today for why we should care about Ukraine and their sovereignty?
True. Yeah, and this is where, one of Reagan's many gifts obviously was as a communicator and an orator, and he was really willing to sometimes speak hard truths to the American people that public sentiment didn't want to hear. I'll come back to this on Ukraine in a second, but for example, he's very committed to free trade when most of the country and most of his party was still very protectionist. So he was regularly making, speeches and radio addresses saying, hey, here's why free trade is better for us. Here's why we don't want to indulge protectionism, even though politically that would have been better for him. Similarly, he was regularly making the case to the people, the American people, about the malevolence of Moscow and the Soviet Union and our need to keep faith with our allies and our need to make these sacrifices. And for him, he would put in the context of it's good for America and it's good for the broader world. It's good for our values and our interests. And so he knew that his strength and credibility as president depended on a lot of public support. And so he very regularly was making the case to the American people on any number of big issues that he wanted their support on, even if it was something that might not be initially popular.
Yeah, and on a related point, another audience member has asked what principles of conservatism in foreign policy should we continue to embrace from the Reagan era?
Again, what principles should we continue?
To embrace in terms of Reagan's foreign policy.
Yeah, so I'll just mention a few, and these are the top line ones we would have picked up on, but definitely the commitment to American values, right? I mean, and this was his big break with Nixon and Kissinger, who really only wanted to think in terms of material interests. And for him, it was about American values, and American values being largely good for the world, right? He just saw that as a tremendous distinctive for our country, but also a tremendous asset. That was so inspiring for so many others around the world. And that translates into specific policies, again, with democracy and human rights and promoting freedom and all and like another big principle, of course, is allies. Again, making the case to the American people. I know they drive us crazy. I know they're free riders. But we're better with them than without them. And here's why we need to them. And then the other big one, again, is aligning force diplomacy, saying we need a strong, potent, capable, without peer military, precisely so we don't have to use it in war, precisely to enable at least the possibility of diplomatic outcomes. So those would be at least a few of the key ones I'd point to.
And we had an audience question come in on this point asking, is it politically dangerous for a president to publicly back diplomacy by force if they are unsure that they will have the support of Congress or the public if a red line is crossed? As an example, the failure of Obama's red line in Syria.
Yes, it is politically risky. No, and again, there's no easy answers to this. So it is a fact that if a president is going to threaten the use of force, you do have to be ready to back it up. Now, but consider the alternatives. If you unilaterally, preemptively take force off the table entirely, as Biden has done with Ukraine, you then make aggression a lot more likely, almost a certainty. And again, I don't want us getting in a shooting war with Russia over Ukraine. Okay, that is not an outcome we want. But the only chance we would have had to stop that from happening was at least the making the credible threat of force. This also applies to our the nuclear issue we have with Iran. And so that's why there were so many tense moments in the Cold War under Reagan, where we did come close to some use of force with the Soviets. But because he always enabled the diplomatic off ramp, we were able to avoid those. So yeah, there certainly is a risk. But I think laying out for the American people what the alternatives are, and laying out that the best chance for a peaceful outcome and not having to actually fire the guns is to have the credible threat of it. Peace through strength, right? So.
Yeah, we have a question from a member of our advisory board, former Congressman Matt Thornberry, asking how much resonance does waging a battle of ideas, democracy versus authoritarianism, have today within the U.S. and internationally?
Okay, no, I heard from Congressman Thorn. Oh, I see it there. Sorry, the audio was a little off. So, Congressman, great to have you here, and of course, you were part of the original Reagan Revolution. So I know I'm speaking to someone who was a firsthand part of it. Obviously, while there are some differences today, I think that if anything, we now have a newfound resonance of that battle of ideas compared to even where we were 10 or 15 years ago. So that's what I mean about things have somewhat come full circle, right? So just again, looking at the Chinese Communist Party, waging genocide in Xinjiang against the Uyghur Muslims, a cataclysmic cover-up of the early COVID outbreak. I mean, they bear considerable responsibility for the millions of deaths around the world. Obviously, their aggression in Tibet, their threats against Taiwan. I mean, it is a perfect case study of a tyranny, and that is not something that we want. And I think that while I'm very supportive of a much more hawkish stance towards China, we have not done enough in waging the battle of ideas there, of showing the benefits of a free society. And sure, democracy has all sorts of imperfections, right? We could do a whole special Vandenberg session on the liabilities and deficiencies of democracy. But again, I much prefer ours to the alternatives. Similarly with what we're seeing in Russia as well.
Bill, before we close today, is there a question we didn't ask you that you wish we had?
So we've covered a lot, Amanda. Yeah, and I know I've thrown a lot at everybody. So don't get me up or I'll start pontificating again. Okay, I will give you one other one. Sorry, we've got a couple minutes. Let me mention this. Most of our discussion today has very rightly been about Reagan's Cold War policies, right? That's the defining attribute of it. But one of the themes I do pick up in my book that I think really bears appreciating is the Reagan administration also had some tremendous legacies that were not divorced from the Cold War, but in other areas. I'll just mention two: Asia, and then the international economic order, right? So coming in, taking office, Reagan really engineers a profound transformation in the U.S. posture in Asia. The previous three presidencies, Nixon, Ford, and Carter, had all waged a China first strategy, right? We need to make China our main partner in Asia. All of our Asia policy is going to flow from China. Reagan jettisons that. He says, no, we're going to have a Japan first policy in Asia. Japan is our primary ally there. They're the only democracy. They're our most important trade partner, so on and so forth. But then with Japan, he had a big problem. Most Americans primarily saw Japan as an economic competitor that was taking our jobs, so on and so forth. They happen to be an alliance partner. Reagan reverses that. He makes Japan primarily a strategic partner that does still happen to be a nettlesome economic competitor. But that's what enabled us to eventually get past the trade war with Japan. Likewise, in Asia, he wanted to rebalance the China-Taiwan equation. Carter was ready to completely throw Taiwan under the bus. Reagan comes in and says, look, we do need to have a collaborative partnership with China. We're going to work on that, but we're not going to go throw Taiwan away. And so that's why he comes up with the 1982 communique, which still largely governs our relations with Taiwan today. And then third was he wanted to see more democracies in Asia. And so when he takes office, the only Asian democracy is Japan. By the time he leaves, South Korea has gone through a peaceful democratic transition. Taiwan is on its way to one, the Philippines as well. And so Asia is a profoundly important part of his legacy. Then the other, again, profoundly important part of his legacy was the international economic order and free trade. He was the first American political leader. He essentially invented NAFTA. He's the first American political leader to call for NAFTA in 1979 when he's just a candidate. He presides over a significant expansion of the free trade order. And again, I know that's fallen into disfavor in recent times. There needs to be some recalibrations, but the alternative of autarky and protectionism and penury is not the way to go. And for Reagan, free trade was about partly free enterprise and free market principles, but also a way to bind our allies together. And as we're now in this competition with China, I'm all about decoupling, right? We should be trading a lot less with China, but that doesn't mean that we retreat to a fortress America. It means we need to be trading more with our European and Asian allies. So it's about a sort of a reoriented that along Reagan-esque lines. Okay, there, you asked me for another question. There it was. Okay.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Will. You've given us certainly a lot to think about and a lot to look forward to in your book out this fall, The Peacemaker, on President Reagan's foreign policy. It was such a pleasure having you today. We had a great discussion. We're looking forward to hopefully seeing our audience members for our next event with Dr. Nadia Schadlow, which will be in a couple of weeks. And we'll be discussing the national security strategy preview with her for the Biden administration. So thank you to everyone for joining us today. And thank you again to Will for